I'm super excited about the project I'm going to share with you today. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to make my plush sloth pattern. This project is super fun. They're so cuddly and adorable, which I just love. It can be a bit of a challenge working with fur, but it's totally worth it. They also have connecting claws, which you can do with magnets, snaps, or Velcro. This is all done with hand stitching or on a regular sewing machine. And in future videos, we may go over how to make some cute little accessories for our sloth, like this little backpack here. So I hope you enjoy this tutorial. Let's get started. Let's begin by going over our supplies. For the sloth, you're going to need some fabric for the body, fabric for the face, felt for accents on the face, a pair of safety eyes. The eyes I'm using are 16mm, and you're also going to want some embroidery floss as well as Poly-fil stuffing. My favorite option to use when making the sloth is to use faux fur for the body and arms. I love this swirl fur. I think it works really well for this project, and you can find it at most Joann stores, which is really nice. And for the face, I like to use fleece. You can also use fleece for the face accents if you like, and if you want to, you can use fleece for the whole body. I've used fur, fleece, and flannel to make this project, and the fur is my favorite, but it is pretty tricky to work with because it slides around. I think flannel's actually a little bit harder because it doesn't stretch and you have to be a lot more careful when you're stuffing it. Fleece is probably the easiest fabric to use when making the project, but I really love the feel of the fur, so we're going to be using fur today in the video. A few things to know when working with faux fur fabric. The first is that it can be very messy. These little bits of fur can get all over the place, so I like to have a lint roller handy when I'm working with fur. I also like to have a garbage can close. Being prepared for all the little flyaways can be helpful when working with fur because they do get all over the place, so keep that in mind. The next thing that you're going to want to look for when you're working with your fur is the pile. The pile is the direction that the hairs are going. It usually runs parallel to the selvage, so if you can identify the selvage on your fabric, you can usually find the pile. On my fabric today, it's really hard to tell because of the swirls, and it really doesn't matter so much. But just to give myself a guide, I'm gonna mark the direction of my pile going the same way as my selvage. Let me show you what this would look like on a fur with a more noticeable pile. This gray faux fur has a much more noticeable pile than the swirl fur. It's got a really great texture, so I love it, but we'd have to be really careful about getting that direction right. So when you're looking at your fur, kind of think of the way that you would brush the strands. On this fur, it would be brushing down like this would be the correct way. If I try and go the opposite way, you can see that it completely messes up the direction of the hairs. It's not intended for them to lay this direction. They're supposed to lay this way. So when you sew with fur, you have to know what that direction is. Otherwise, you could end up with a stuffed animal with the fur going the wrong direction, and that can look pretty funny. So on this fabric here, the pile is going down towards the bottom. On the fabric, I'd mark my pile going down towards the bottom. I usually draw my mark in the selvage area just so that it's out of my way because I know I'm not going to cut my pieces there. But it's a really good indicator to make sure that you do your cut layout correctly. On the pattern pieces, there are arrows on the pieces. This indicates the direction of the pile. So you want the arrows on your pattern pieces to be going the same direction as the arrow you just drew on your fabric. So keep that in mind if you're planning to work with fur. After you've selected your fabric for your project, the next thing you want to do is pick your pattern. There are two different designs for the face of the sloth, one with the eye accents angling up and one with the eye accents angling down. You can choose whichever one you like. Today I'm going to use the pattern with the eye accents angling down. You can find the free pattern for this project located on my website, which is linked in the description below. For most of the pieces on this pattern, the seam allowance is not included. As a result, when you lay out your pieces, you're going to want to make sure that you keep space in between them, at least a ½ inch, so that you have your seam allowance when you cut. A free cut layout is also available on my website. Before you start cutting, make sure that you lay out all of your pieces so that you can make sure that you have enough space for each piece. Once you've made sure that you have enough fabric and that your pieces are spaced out, you're ready to trace. What I like to do when I am cutting out my pieces is I like to trace them onto the wrong side of the fabric. You want to make sure that you use something to trace that's not going to be visible on the front of the fabric, as well as something that's not going to disappear. So while I love using air erase markers, it's not a good option for this because I'm going to need these reference lines later. My favorite thing to use when tracing my pattern is simply a coordinating color Sharpie. You want to be careful, you don't want to press the Sharpie too hard, you don't want it to bleed to the front, but I find that on fur and fleece it works quite well. Normally I'd use a more pale pink option, but I do want it to be able to show up on camera, so that's why I'm using a little darker pink today. When you're tracing your pieces, be sure to transfer the significant markings. So on the claw pieces, you'll notice some lines that extend beyond the edge. This is to help you when joining the pieces later. So go ahead and transfer those lines by drawing them up away from your paper. The front claws have 2 marks, and the back claws will have just 1. This will help you place them in the right position later. Remember, keep your pieces at least a ½ inch away from each other. Also, notice on the claws that it asks you to cut 2 and 2 reverse. This means you're going to cut 2 with the paper facing up and 2 with the paper facing down. This will give you a left and right hand side. Trace your pattern pieces onto the fur in a similar manner. Remember, make sure to leave that ½ inch of space in between your pieces, and don't forget to pay attention to the direction of the pile as well as the arrows on the pattern pieces. After you've transferred all of your markings onto your fabric, it's time to start cutting. You need to remember that not all of these pieces have the seam allowance included, so we're going to be cutting a ½ inch away from the line on most of our pieces. This is going to be true for all of our fleece pieces. I'm going to use my purple thing to help me as a guide. This end of the purple thing is a ½ inch wide, so I can see about how far away from my line I need to cut. You could also use a ruler to help you. It doesn't need to be perfect, but you do want to make sure that you keep that distance. So I'm going to cut around these pieces with a ½ inch seam allowance. When the little darts dip in like this, you don't need to follow along that. You can just cut around the edge. So I've cut out my face piece using a ½ inch seam allowance. I'm going to do the same thing on all the fleece pieces for the face and claws. When you get to the fur, there are a few exceptions for adding the seam allowance. The body back piece, as well as the body belly piece, already have the seam allowance included. For these 2 pieces, you can cut directly on the line. A few tips for cutting fur. One, this is when it gets really messy, so make sure that you have that lint roller handy. And second, when you cut fur, you don't want to cut the piles. If you just take your scissors and cut like you normally would, you cut those hairs, especially if it has a long pile. And what can happen is it'll end up looking like your plush stuffed animal got a haircut that it didn't need. So when you cut fur, you just cut the back. I like to use the very tip of my scissors, and I'll only open it up just a little and I'll snip, only cutting the back fabric and trying my best not to cut any of the hairs. On my swirl fur, it's not that important, but on furs like the gray that we saw earlier, that would be a big deal. So just slide your scissors along the fabric, opening them up just a smidge, and do your best to only cut the backing fabric. Once the backing fabric is cut, it will separate the furs when you pull the fabric. As you can see, I didn't cut the hairs, they're still there. I'm going to continue cutting around my body belly piece exactly on the line, but when I cut out the bottom, the legs, and the tail, I'm going to leave that 1/4 inch seam allowance just like I did when I was cutting out my fleece pieces. I'll do that and then come back. When you're ready to cut your eye accents, make sure you place one and one reverse. Trace one with your pattern piece right side up. Flip it over and trace another with the pattern piece right side down, and you'll cut these out directly on the line. Next, I'm going to mark the placement of the safety eyes on the eye accent pieces. I'm going to do this on the right side of the fabric. The side that I traced the pattern piece on was the wrong side, so I'm going to be looking at the side that I did not trace on previously. To do this, I like to take my pattern piece and I like to use a hole punch and punch out just the center of that circle. Then I'll lay my pattern piece on top of my fabric and put a dot in the center. And I'll do the same on the other side. Then I'll have those marks to help me when I place my eyes on my sloth later. Next, let's add the accents to the face. Take the fleece that you're using for the face and turn it right side up. So this is the side without your markings. Then take your pattern piece and cut out the shape for the accent of the eyes. Center your pattern piece on the face, and remember it has a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so keep that in mind. Then place your felt pieces right side up on top of them. This will help you make sure that they're placed evenly. Pin them in place. You can stitch the eye accents in place by hand, or you can stitch it on the machine. I'm going to use my sewing machine today, and I'm going to be using a zigzag stitch. I like to use a zigzag stitch that has a width of 3.5 and a length of about 2.5. When I sew my zigzag, I like the majority of the stitch to be on the eye accent, so I'll be stitching over here, and then the very far edge of the stitch will come just on the edge of the felt. As you begin sewing, make sure your pin is out of your way. Make sure that your machine is set to the zigzag with your desired length and width, and make sure that your needle is going in at the correct position. So for me, my needle is going in at the left-hand side through all the layers of fabric, and then when it goes through on the right, I want it to hit just past the felt. And I'm going to use my purple thing to help me keep my fabric flat as I go. since this is curved, you may have to stop frequently to adjust, and that's okay. Just go slow. And then lift up your foot and turn as you need to. Once you've attached the eye accent on one side, go ahead and repeat the process on the other, and then it's time to attach the nose. The nose is so tiny that I find it's quite difficult to add it using the machine, so I like to just hand sew it. So I'm using a regular old needle and thread, and I'm just going to use a whip stitch to attach this. What I like to do next is stitch the mouth. I usually stitch this by hand using a regular backstitch. The first thing I like to do is draw the mouth with a vanishing marker. So this is an air erase fabric pen, which I really love. And so I'm going to draw the mouth first so I can make sure I have it in position I want. If you don't have an air erase pen, I would be really careful because any marks you make will be visible on your final project. One thing that you can do as a guide if you have a hard time drawing freehand is you can poke holes at key points on the pattern piece and then use the pattern to mark the placement of those locations. And then when I place my pattern on my sloth, I can mark those key places. Which will help give me a guide when I'm sketching. Another thing I like to do to keep it balanced is when I'm actually doing the sewing, I will count the number of stitches that I use so that I can use the same number of stitches on each side. That also helps me keep it balanced. So if I use 5 stitches when stitching the curve here, I'll try to use 5 stitching it here. I'm using my black embroidery floss and I'm just using a single strand. I've got my knot already tied at the end and I'm ready to start. If you're not sure how to do a back stitch, I have some links below that show you how to do those hand stitching skills. Once all the decoration's been added to the face, it's time to give it some shape. We're going to do this by stitching the darts. So take your face piece and fold it with right sides together at the dart lines. The darts are the little triangle indents. So you want to fold it at the tip and you want the 2 points on the ends of the triangle to also match up. So what I like to do is I like to take a pin and go through 1 point on the triangle and then through the opposite point of the triangle and pinch it at the bottom. This helps me know that the 2 top points of that triangle are aligned. And then I'll place my pin. And when I stitch, I'm going to stitch right along this edge. So I'm going to go all the way to the end of my seam allowance and just stitch straight across there. And I'm going to do that for all of the darts. Let's add the safety eyes. The first thing you need to do is create a hole to put the post through. When you make the hole for the eye, you do need to be really careful. You don't want it to be too large. If the hole that you create is too big, then it's possible that it could tear even more and your eye will fall out, especially once it's filled with stuffing. So make as small a hole as possible for this step. I like to use my seam ripper to create the hole, but you do have to be pretty careful. I like to do the 2 layers of fabric separately. So first I'm going to place my seam ripper through the dot that I made on the eye, and I'm gonna cut just the felt, and it's super, super, super tiny. Like it barely slides at all. And then what I do is I poke a pin straight through and go to the back side, and that will mark where my seam ripper enters the fabric. And then from this side, I'll cut a teeny tiny little hole in the fleece. Make sure that your seam ripper is not going through the front. Make sure it's only going through the fleece. And then again, keep your hole super, super, super tiny so you barely slide it at all. Just enough to separate a few threads in the fabric. And then you slide your post through. And you can see how your fabric will stretch around the post. Since fleece stretches more than the felt, you sometimes have to cut a larger hole in the felt. So if it's not going through, just take your seam ripper and increase the size of that hole, but only do so on the felt, not on the fleece. Check its position on the front. And once it looks good, add the backing. You want to be careful once you place the back on, it cannot be removed. So make sure you like the placement of your eye and then snap the back down. And your eye's in place. Let's repeat on the other side. It's time to start working on the arms and legs for our sloth. One thing that you'll want to decide is if you want your sloth to be able to hang freely. If you do, then you're going to want to choose the fixture that you'd like to use on your sloth. A few options include snaps, Velcro, or magnets. Magnets can be placed on the sloth now, or they can be added later after the sloth is complete. A few things that you need to know if you decide to add them now. If you add magnets now, sometimes they can interfere with the sewing process later or with your machine. So if you're not comfortable with that, you may want to wait. Other options include Velcro, which is really easy to apply, and you could apply that now. If you do decide to use Velcro or snaps, when you apply your Velcro and snaps, make sure that you have matching pieces. So for example, both of these have the 2 dashes on the edge there, so I know that these 2 match, and you want them to be mirror images of each other. That way, when your sloth is constructed, it will attach appropriately. Make sure that the Velcro snaps are placed on the right side so that they'll be able to meet again when the sloth is finished. I'm going to use magnets today, but I'm going to add them after the sloth is constructed. Since we're going to be assembling the legs, it's time to make sure that you match up your pieces. So here I have the front legs for my sloth. The front legs are a little bit longer than the back legs. The front legs have the double dash that's listed on the bottom, and I'm going to match them up with the double dash claw pieces. You'll notice that the claws and the dashes are in the same location, so they match up. So I want to make sure that I have all of my pieces set up so I don't accidentally mix and match when I'm sewing. Once I have this all organized and arranged, it's time to add the claws to the leg. To do this, turn your pieces right side up and align the straight edges. We're going to pin this in place. It can be kind of tricky working with fur, so you do want to make sure that the pile is brushed away from the edge. And then align that straight edge as best you can. What I like to do is place a pin in the corner. So I go from front to back through the corner on my drawn line, and I make sure that it goes through the corner on the drawn line on the other piece. I'll do that for both corners. And then I'll pin in the middle. And I'm going to sew across this straight edge. Once the fleece has been attached to the fur, one thing that's helpful is to sew your seam allowance in place. So I like to simply finger press my seam open, so that just means to take your fingers and fold it flat. And then I'm going to stitch in the seam allowance on both sides here, on the left and the right, to hold that in place so that it stays open. I find that it makes it a little bit easier when you're assembling the legs. Take two of your leg pieces that are mirror images and lay them right sides together. We need to sew around the two pieces, leaving the top portion here open so that we can stuff. You'll notice if you've ever sewn with fur before that it slides a whole bunch. And so if you pin normally, what happens is it will slide as you're sewing and then you end up way far off your mark. And in plush projects, that can be a bit of a problem because then it means one leg might be way smaller than another. So when I am sewing on fur, what I like to do is what's called pin basting. It's a way of weaving the pin through the fabric so that it stays together better. And so I'll be weaving the pins through the fabric on the line on the front as well as on the line on the back so that the legs can end up being the correct size. It will also help ensure that I have a good seam allowance. When I use pin basting, what I like to do is imagine how I would start if I was on the sewing machine. So if I was on the sewing machine, I'd turn it this way and start at this corner and go down. When I do my pin basting, I'm going to do the opposite. I want all of the pins to point towards my starting point. So if this was like the little trail, all of the points would go this way. So I'm going to start at the other corner and weave my pins in. So I'm going to start at the corner here and I'm going to poke my pin down through both layers of fabric on that line. So I'm going to make sure that the pin goes through the corner and both layers. And then making sure that my pin follows the line on the back, I'm going to press it forward so that it enters the line on the front. And I'm going to keep weaving the pin in the front and the back on that line on both sides as if I was sewing a running stitch. Just like that. And I'm going to do that all the way around, and this will help hold my fabric together so it's really sturdy. One thing that you'll notice is that our lines curve but the pins don't, so you may need more pins as you go along a curve. Okay, my pin basting is complete, and you could see that the tips of the pins are all pointing towards the start of my path. But this will keep my fabric really solidly together while I'm stitching. And I'm going to start here on this corner and go around. The nice thing about pin basting is your fabric will slide off as you hold the pin, and then what's nice about it is that the fabric can actually stay pinned for a really long time until your needle gets close to where the pin is. And so it just stays in place a little longer. To get started, I'm going to slide the leg underneath the foot just like I planned. I'm going to line up my needle so that it lines up exactly with my line, and I'm going to place the needle down right at my corner. I'm going to slide the first pin down a bit so it's out of the path of where the needle is, and then I'm going to do my back stitch. And making sure that my pin is out of the line of path, what I'm going to do is hold the ball. The feed dogs will move the fabric back, and then my pin will stay in place and the fabric will slide off. I can also use the pins to help guide my fabric. Stop as frequently as you need to. Make sure the seams stay open when you get to the claws. Once the leg's been sewn, if you used a fabric that doesn't stretch, such as flannel, you'll want to go ahead and clip the curves. If you're using a stretchy fabric, such as the fleece and fur that I have, then clipping isn't really necessary. And so let's go ahead and turn this right side out. I normally use hemostats to turn, but sometimes it will get caught on the pile in the fur fabric, and that can make it a little tricky. So instead of using it to go to the inside and pinch, I just use it to turn. You could also use something like a wood spoon. So I'll just place it on the outside, separate my fabric, and then push it on down. Do be gentle, you don't want to accidentally get a hole. And then once it's turned right side out, use those hemostats or whatever your turning tool is to make sure it's fully turned and that none of those seams are tucked in. Repeat this process for all the front and back legs. Once you have all 4 of the legs constructed, take the time to make sure they look correct, especially if you've already attached magnets, snaps, or Velcro. You want to make sure that they will attach together the way that they're intended to, so check that now. And if anything doesn't look right, now's the time to fix it. You also want to sew together the 2 tail pieces. place them right sides together and pin baste just like you did the legs. And then stitch around.